All right, thank you all. How are you guys doing today? Great. I'm just going to speak for a little bit and introduce our lunchtime keynote speaker. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce her. Ginger Liu is here. She's the senior counselor to the White House National Economic Council and to the Small Business Administration. Ginger provides advice on a broad range of economic policy matters, mostly related to business and public policy. She has extensive experience in the federal government. Prior to this, she held several high-ranking positions in the Clinton administration, both at the Small Business Administration and the Commerce Department. In addition, Ginger has an extensive background in the private sector as well as a venture capitalist. She's also been involved in the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the past. So you really have somebody who combines both sort of the private sector, public sector, and social sector experience that we find to be really valuable in government. I do want to thank Kieran for the introduction. I want to thank all of you guys for putting together the conference. This is fantastic to see these folks here. As an academic researcher, I know many of you are researchers here today. I want to sort of encourage you again to try to engage with folks in the federal government. We're very willing to talk. We have lots of interesting problems, too many actually than we can handle on our own, as might be evidenced by our performance on some of them. But it'd be great to sort of engage with you guys because, as an academic, I've sat in my office so many times and wondered and banged my head against the wall and asked myself why the people in Washington don't listen to me. But I realized that if you reach out and you sort of engage with folks here, you let them know what you're working on, how you can be useful, you can really make a difference. I know that our timelines are sometimes different. Usually in the White House, we need things by yesterday. And the academic journal publication timeline tends to be, let us just say, with significant more lag time. But while you're waiting for that journal article to come back, there are sort of short-term projects you can do. There's data analysis you can do. And I find that it can inform a lot of things we're doing in the White House. So I'm sure Ginger will say the same thing, but I'd like to make myself available to folks who are interested in these issues, whether it's small business, entrepreneurship, innovation, or other issues concerning the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And I'd be glad to do that afterwards and leave my contact information. I do want to say one personal thing about Ginger, too, because I think it's really important to give you guys context on to what type of person she is. When I first came to Washington, I met with a bunch of economists, and I told them I was interested in small business and entrepreneurship. And they said, well, if you're interested in those topics, there's really only one person to talk to first, and that's Ginger Liu. And when I met with a group of Asian Americans, I said, look, I'm an Asian American. I've never served in government before. I'd love to know more about some of the networks here so I can get acclimated. They said, well, if you're an Asian American serving in government, there's really only one person to talk to. It's Ginger Liu. So I emailed Ginger Liu, and I told her, look, I'm an Asian American economist working at the White House. I think it's about time we met. And of course, as always, she was very prompt, and we met, I believe, the next day, which was impressive for someone as busy as she is. And I remember that first meeting that we had, I think it was at Caribou Coffee, where all the important meetings happen. And since then, Ginger's been a great mentor to me. She's invited me to speak at different panels far beyond my pay grade, which I really appreciate. Sometimes I'm not able to take her up on those because they're above my pay grade, but I really do appreciate her trying to get me involved in a lot of the public outreach that the White House does. Second, she's given me a lot of advice on my career as I sort of navigate how to think about next steps. And I really, Ginger, I haven't always told you that, but I think I really appreciate it and think it's really valuable. We didn't always have such a great network in Washington. Ginger is really responsible as one of the pioneers, sort of laying the foundation for a lot of us who are now coming for our first term in Washington. And we all are really grateful to you. And I should say, sort of your leadership, along with the work of the AAPI initiative, or the initiative here with Karen and Christina and others, it sort of is a great double threat, that we can sort of take that experience, take the sustained effort that you guys are doing, and it helps us do our jobs better. So I want to thank you guys for that. And I will now sort of turn the dais over to Ginger Liu. Thanks for being here, Ginger.
Wow, Ronnie, geez. As you can tell, Ronnie is extraordinarily energetic, and he has so many projects under his scope of responsibility, and he does them all so well. And as his reputation spreads across the federal government and across other federal agencies, he's called upon more and more to share his expertise, and not only in the economic world, but also in the business policy world. And I can't tell you how important it is for senior federal officials across the government to see diversity in leadership roles and to see people who are well-informed, thoughtful, and have deep knowledge in their area of expertise and can bring that type of depth to the policy discussion. It makes all the difference in the world. So thank you, Ronnie, for coming, for taking the leave of absence from Duke. And Karen and Mia and Christine and others, thank you for organizing this event. I will just take a moment to apologize right after my remarks. I can take maybe one or two questions, but I have to run to another meeting. As you know, I got asked to pitch it at the very last minute and had to sort of rearrange some things. I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the economy, sort of where we're at, talk a little bit about the tax bill. You're hearing a lot about that discussion right now, and what does that mean for us? And then I'd like to talk a little bit about data and why it's so important. So, you know, if you ask anyone on the street today, in fact, just about anyone, they have an opinion about the economy. They have an opinion about what needs to be fixed, what's wrong, and how to do it. You know, it can be the guy at the laundromat. It can be Dr. Larry Summers. But there is no shortage of opinions as to what should be done. But these questions about fiscal policy are especially pressing right now because fiscal issues are at the center of the economic concerns in Europe and around the world. And while almost everything about fiscal policy is debatable and is being debated, the fiscal policy choices of the United States that we make, the choices that we make today, will have significant impact over the next several years. And we can be heartened by the fact that we have seen some positive, strong fiscal results because of the Recovery Act. The American economy is growing and creating jobs again. But, you know, I think we can be honest and also say that we're not exactly thrilled with some of the statistics. The third quarter reports of GDP growth at 2.5% suggests that we are headed in the right direction. And yet economists will note that at 2.5% growth, that's basically neutral in terms of the number of jobs created. Consumer spending has increased at a pace of 2.8%. Yet we also know it is equally important that consumers take the time to repair their fiscal and financial health. It's also encouraging to see that the first-time claims for jobless aid fell by 17,000. Again, all positive signs, but there are still too many people who are not working, who are looking for jobs, and it will be a slow climb out of a very steep valley. Since 2007, the manufacturing and construction sectors have each lost 2 million jobs, with finance, hospitality, and retailing accounting for 2 million more. In total, 8 million jobs were lost, which is more than the jobs lost from the 1981, 1991, and the 2001 recessions combined. Unlike past recessions, small businesses that were canaries in the coal mine this time around, shedding jobs at a furious rate beginning in mid-2007, signaling an oncoming economic crisis. All total, small businesses have shed 5.4 million jobs. 62% of net job losses comes from small businesses. And behind these statistics lie millions of stories of Americans who have seen the basic foundations of their economic security erode. For millions of Americans, the financial challenges grind on. I can tell from personal experience, at the beginning of this administration, well, first of all, let me say, I have 2 stepchildren. Both are married. At the beginning of this administration, 3 out of the 4 were unemployed. So, you know, we all know someone who's been looking for a job, who's gotten laid off, who's been unemployed. So clearly, the pain and the suffering continues. It's added to the frustration. I think the issue now going forward is how can we change this equation? We know we need to reduce the deficit. We know we need to stimulate growth. And we need to do it responsibly. And yet, what you think is an essential program may be considered a frivolous program by another person. So how do we make sure that we're doing this in a responsible, balanced way? The key, I believe, is to move forward with the president's three-pronged strategy to reduce the deficit, spur growth through targeted investments, and implement regulatory reform. The president has made several important commitments to bring down the deficit by $1 trillion. He has proposed a 3-year freeze on discretionary spending outside of security. He has, as you well know, supported letting the 2001-2003 tax cuts for the wealthiest 2% of Americans to expire. And he has put forward budgets that would root out waste and outdated spending in every area, even in defense. Secretary Gates has suggested that his procurement reforms would save over $330 billion. Now, you've all read about the other recommendations to reduce the deficit, from the recommendations from the Deficit Commission, recommendations from the Republican leadership, recommendations from the National Governors Association, and many, many other stakeholders. Over the next several months, all these recommendations will be reviewed and sorted through. It will take time. But in addition to just reducing spending, one of the president's key areas is how do we spur growth? For every 0.75% increase in GDP, we can reduce the deficit by $75 billion and increase people's incomes and create jobs. And one way to do that is to make adjustments to our tax policies. So let me, if I can, spend a few minutes to discuss how the recently announced tax deal delivers and impacts Americans in a very real way. As you know, throughout the tax debate, the president has argued for the extension of the middle-class tax cuts only. Middle-class families have been hard hit, not only by this recession, but over the past decade, and they deserve relief. Raising their taxes right now would have been a grave injustice and would have dealt a serious blow to our economic recovery. But Republicans in Congress fought to permanently extend the tax cuts for the wealthiest 2% of Americans. This is where the debate has stood for the last couple of weeks. And without a willingness to give on both sides, this is probably where it would have been and would have remained well into next year. So the president's choice was to find a compromise or allow the stalemate to continue. That would have allowed taxes to go up for nearly every American beginning January 1. This would have meant a $3,000 tax increase on a typical American family and could have cost our economy well over 1 million jobs. The president refused to allow that to happen. But he also refused to sign on to any agreement that gave millionaires and billionaires a tax cut, but did not extend unemployment insurance for laid-off American workers, or give additional tax cuts for working families and small businesses. So here's what the tax package means for many of us. This deal will put in place a 2% employee payroll tax cut for all workers. Just about every worker should take home more money starting in January. If you make $50,000 a year, you will pay $1,000 less in taxes owed, which means you will take home about $82 more each month. Double that for each worker earning around $100,000. Now, $82 or $164 a month more may not sound like a lot, but for some people, that's a week's worth of groceries. It can help pay for the heating bill, and that benefit comes to the American worker beginning January 1. There's also good news for families on several fronts. The child tax credit will make sure that families don't see their taxes rise. Taxpayers with less than $75,000 or $110,000 for those filing jointly can receive a tax credit of up to $1,000 for every child. Now, this is a tax credit. So again, it reduces the amount of taxes you actually owe. That means you get to keep $1,000 in your own bank account. This particular provision will last for 2 years. The American Opportunity Tax Credit has been proposed for a 2-year extension. So families with kids in college can receive a benefit of up to $2,500 that will impact over 8 million students. So the families don't see the cost of sending their kids to college shoot up. Then there is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which will help low-income families. Many of us know people in our communities who are living on the margins. This particular Earned Income Tax Credit has a particular benefit for those earning as little as $13,000 a year to as much as $48,000 a year. Depending upon your income level, you could get a tax credit ranging from $457 to as much as $5,666. That's more than $400 each month that you get to keep. So when you start adding up, $82 here, another $82 there, another $300 here, the American worker is starting to keep more of their hard-earned money. And they can use that to not only pay down their debt, to make purchases, necessary purchases. Maybe they want to fund their 401k or their IRA account. Maybe they want to save some money. But all of this is real money, translates into real money into someone's pocket. And then finally, the alternative minimum tax. All of us, whether we know it or not, may get caught up in owing taxes because of the alternative minimum tax. It says it can apply to someone who's earning as little as $33,700. So a married couple making $85,000 with 2 college-age kids would have had to pay $4,500 more in taxes without this deal. So as you start, this would have an impact on 21 million taxpayers. So again, when you start adding up the various, when you start doing the math, you start seeing how this could really have a very significant benefit to the American worker. And last but not least, the deal extends unemployment benefits for another 13 months. Now, over the past year, we've been extending it for 2 months, 6 months, and 3 months, leaving those who are most vulnerable in this uncertain world as to whether or not they can get their monthly unemployment, their weekly unemployment benefits. This will benefit more than 2 million Americans who have been laid off through no fault of their own. Finally, the tax deal calls for continuation of certain tax benefits for businesses to invest and create jobs by allowing them to completely write off their investments next year, as well as extend the current cap on long-term capital gains tax and dividend payments. The President has been arguing for this particular extension since September as a way to help American businesses create jobs. So, I think there's been a lot of debate about who's getting the benefit of this tax deal. And if you really peel back the verbiage and really analyze each of the key components, I believe most of the benefits, in fact, the key critical benefits, extend to middle-class America and to the working person. Now, if I'd like to switch to another topic, which is near and dear to me, and that is the need for better quantitative data. And you kind of think, I'm not an economist. I don't pretend to be an economist. I'm not a researcher, so please excuse me. I'm a lawyer, so excuse me again. What can I say? But when I began working at the White House in the beginning of the administration, small businesses were in a terrible bind. We had seen more than 13 straight quarters of constrained lending to small businesses. And when we wanted to find out, well, what's really happening with the capital markets, what's happening with financial institutions and making loans to small businesses, we went to the regulators. We went to the Federal Reserve, we went to the FDIC, and we said, we'd like to see your data. And they said, what data? The Senior Federal Loan Officer Survey collects data once a year. So they were giving us data about 2008 loans. And we said, well, this doesn't make any sense. This is totally irrelevant to what's going on in 2009. And the data spanned 2007, 2008 because of the way they collect the data. And it was, and I will tell you, we went to proprietary sources, we went to other financial institutions, we consulted with consultants, we talked to researchers, and it was very discouraging to find that there was very little quantitative data about the characteristics of small business lending. And so here we were trying to come up with public policies without evidence, without data to support those policies. And I can only tell you that without the type of data that you all are focused on and the type of data we need, I think you can potentially end up with bad public policy. Now, in the case of the small business programs, we were able to fall back on some of the past characteristics and lending practices and the histories that were accumulated and gathered by the Small Business Administration. But we probably spent or lost more than 2 or 3 months in trying to identify sources of data, and it was a very frustrating process. Let me also tell you another story. During my time in the Clinton administration, I was the general counsel at the Department of Commerce under Secretary Ron Brown, who was a great, great man. And the Census Bureau was one of the agencies at the Department of Commerce, and I had 350 lawyers to supervise. Probably an oxymoron. And each of the bureaus had their own set of lawyers and their own issues, et cetera. I had patent and trademark. I had the NOAA, so I had marine mammal protection, and then I had the Census Bureau and all this other stuff. Anyway, we were in the process of defending, at that time, the 1990 census and the use of statistical sampling. This then Census Bureau director, who was a holdover from the previous administration, came to me and said that he wanted to get rid of all the ethnic advisory boards. And I said, on what basis? Like, do you have factual basis? And he didn't have any data. And could he give me any public policy reasons? And he couldn't give me any public policy reasons. Then I said, can you give me any budgetary reasons? And he said, well, they're expensive. But again, no data. And then I just said, can you give me any legal reasons? And he said, no. So my answer to him is, no, you are not eliminating these things. And again, this is an example of where it's really important to get people from our communities in political leadership positions who can either be advocates for certain policies or can stop bad decisions that would have an impact on our communities. And again, by pushing this point about asking for data, justifications, I mean, these were not rocket science questions, okay? But pushing, I think people said, okay, next time I go in with a request, I better be really, really well prepared, have my data lined up, but also build that sort of factual case for whatever proposal they're putting forward. Then let me, if I can, just relate one other story. About a month ago, I was in Atlanta and I spoke to the Federal Reserve Bank there. And I was asked to submit a couple of suggestions, ideas for various research projects that they might undertake. So I was speaking completely off the record, okay, without White House approval, in my own personal capacity. This was not attributed to the administration, blah, blah, blah. But I told the story about the unbanked. We know that many people in the ethnic communities do not use financial institutions, do not rely upon financial institutions. But it wasn't until the FDIC funded a survey which really did some analysis in terms of identifying how deep this problem was. And they found that 54% of African American families, African American households, excuse me, are either unbanked or underbanked. 44% of Hispanic households are either unbanked or underbanked. And then I started making a few dot connections. When I look at the SBA loan program and the number of loans made to Hispanic and African Americans, business owners, it's very low. Then I thought, well, let me think. If they're unbanked or underbanked, how can they get a credit score? So, and if you don't have a credit score, how do you get a loan? And so my challenge to the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta was to do some research on this particular issue of coming up with alternative policies, underwriting criteria, alternatives to the credit score in terms of how we can provide tools to financial institutions to assess the creditworthiness of borrowers from whether it's African American, Hispanic, Asian American, and Pacific Island communities. Because if we continue to use a formula that's not being used by almost the majority of these communities, then we're going to leave a large population behind. They will always be on the margins of the financial world. How can they get capital to start a business? How can they get capital to grow a business? How can they get capital to just survive in this economy in terms of getting a credit card? So I personally believe, and I will say, this is my personal comment, not the White House comment, that I believe that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders are undercounted. And that impacts our ability to access federal programs, to engage in meaningful discussions about disparity, about how some ethnic members of our community, when you talk about the Hmongs, Vietnamese, others, are clearly in the category of economically and socially disadvantaged. But we have little empirical data to continue to sort of support that discussion and that policy, put forward that advocacy. Data matters, and we need it, and our communities need it. And that's how we get a seat at the table. It's how we make sure we have a voice in the policy discussions. It's why people like having Ronnie come and work in the White House makes all the difference in the world in terms of making sure that we are not left behind, we are not missing in action when we have these types of policy discussions. So thank you for allowing me to speak for a few minutes. It's been a wonderful privilege. Thank you. I'm happy to take one or two questions. If they're hard questions, I'm going to give them to Ronnie. No questions. I'm great. Golden. No. Oh. Yes.
Just a quick question on the Affordable Care Act. Are there special provisions for small business owners in order to get insurance?
Yeah, yes, there is. And that, now you're venturing in a field I have no background, but yes, there are provisions in the Health Care Act in terms of the public options, et cetera. But I don't know, Ronnie, if you know anything more about that.
Yeah. No, so Ginger's correct. There's several provisions in the Affordable Care Act. One is the tax credit of 35% for small business owners. For eligible small business owners, there's some size and wage characteristics. There's also some new sort of self-employed tax credit as well. So not just for small business owners with employees, but also people with self-employed without employees. Both those are important for that.
Okay, the last one, yes.
I'm glad you raised the question from your personal view in terms of unbanked and underbanked, because I'm currently conducting a study on banking access among immigrants, compare U.S. and Canada. But I'm aware about like you said, the home data provide rich resources for American scholars to study home purchase loans and refinance loans. And in my own research, I've asked financial institutions I interviewed, do they ever want to release their CNI data, CNI loan data? And they said, there's no federal mandate. Why should we do it?
Right.
So in my case, I actually saw some of their balance sheet. They did show me, but I cannot publish them. I cannot say anything because they don't give. So I'm just wondering, would you, as advisor in the White House, would push for at least certain form of CNI loans being desegregated by race, ethnicity, and also by the approval applicants and all those kind of data, possibly public accessible or as a confidential data set so researcher can do actual research? Thank you.
I'm glad you asked that question because discussions are going on right now with the regulators to try and see if we can. We've actually put forward a proposal with about 13 points requests in terms of the different types of data fields that we want. So hopefully we'll see some results from those discussions in the near future. So again, thank you for having me and enjoy the rest of your conference.